Brussels, Belgium, 1943. In the shadow of Nazi occupation, where every street corner held the eyes of collaborators and every knock on the door could mean death, a 57-year-old woman stood at the window of a Catholic boarding school and watched the city she loved disappear beneath a tide of swastikas. Her name was Léonie Peclet, but the world knew her as Mother Superior of the Convent of the Sisters of St. Mary. For 2 decades she had dedicated her life to prayer, education, and the simple routine of caring for children whose parents could no longer keep them safe. But on this particular morning in early spring, as German trucks rumbled through the cobblestone streets and Gestapo officers tightened their grip on every Jewish family remaining in the capital, she was about to make a decision that would transform her from a servant of God into an enemy of the Third Reich. The war had been raging for nearly 4 years, and Belgium had been under the boot of occupation since 1940. What began as a military invasion had metastasized into something far more sinister, a systematic hunt for every man, woman, and child of Jewish descent. The deportations had started quietly, almost politely, with notices and registration requirements, but by 1943 the mask had come off entirely, and the transports to the east were running day and night. Mother Superior Léonie had never considered herself a rebel. She was not a soldier, not a spy, not a resistance fighter in the traditional sense. She was a woman of faith who believed in the power of prayer and the sanctity of human life. Yet, as the Nazi machine ground through Belgium with ruthless efficiency, she found herself standing at a crossroads that no amount of prayer could navigate alone. The convent had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary where children from troubled homes could find stability and education. But now, in the darkest days of the occupation, it had become something else entirely, a hiding place for 74 Jewish children whose parents had made the most agonizing choice any mother or father could make. They had handed their sons and daughters over to strangers, to nuns who wore crosses and spoke of Christ, because it was the only chance their children had to survive. These were not orphans. These were children with families who loved them, families who were being rounded up and shipped away to places with names that would later become synonymous with hell itself: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The parents knew they were likely going to die. But maybe, just maybe, if they could hide their children behind convent walls and Christian prayers, those children might live. For months, the arrangement had worked. The convent operated under the guise of normalcy, its daily routines of Mass and meals providing cover for the 74 children who had been given false names and false identities. Sarah became Sophie. David became Daniel. They learned Catholic prayers they did not believe in, and attended services for a God that was not their own, all while knowing that a single slip of the tongue, a single moment of forgetfulness, could bring the Gestapo crashing through the doors. Mother Superior Léonie walked a tightrope every single day, balancing the spiritual mission of her order with the very real and very illegal act of harboring enemies of the Reich. She was not naive. She knew that if the Nazis discovered what she was doing, the consequences would be absolute. The children would be deported, the nuns would be arrested, and she herself would likely face execution. Yet every morning when she rose for prayer, she did not ask God to release her from this burden. She asked him for the strength to carry it just one more day. But on the morning of April 15th, 1943, everything changed. The city had been bombed before, brief raids by Allied planes that struck military targets and disappeared back into the clouds. But this was different. The air raid sirens began to wail at dawn, and they did not stop. The sound was relentless, a rising and falling scream that sent every person in Brussels scrambling for shelter. Mother Superior Léonie stood in the hallway of the convent, listening to the distant thunder of explosions growing louder, growing closer, and she realized with cold certainty that the building she stood in was no longer safe. The children in her care, 74 souls who had already been hunted once, were now in danger of being buried alive beneath the rubble of a bombing raid they had nothing to do with. She had hidden them from the Gestapo, but she could not hide them from the sky. The decision came to her not as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, crushing weight. If they stayed, they would die. If they fled into the streets during a bombing raid, They would be exposed, visible, vulnerable to any Nazi patrol or collaborator looking for easy prey. There was no good choice. There was no safe choice. There was only the choice between certain death and possible survival. And so, as the bombs began to fall in earnest, as the windows of the convent rattled in their frames and dust drifted down from the ceilings, Mother Superior Leonie did the only thing she could do. She gathered the 74 children, looked into their terrified faces and told them they were leaving. Not tomorrow, not after the raid. Now. Right now. While the city burned around them. What happened next would become one of the most astonishing and least known acts of heroism in the entire Second World War. A 57-year-old woman, armed with nothing but faith and a desperate plan, was about to lead 74 children through a city under bombardment, past Nazi patrols, and into the uncertain safety of the Belgian countryside. The odds were impossible. The risks were unthinkable. And the world would not hear her name for decades. But on that morning, as the bombs fell and the sirens screamed, Leonie Peclet stopped being a Mother Superior and became something else entirely, a guardian angel walking 74 children through the gates of hell. The convent had not always been a fortress of secrets. Before the war, it was simply a boarding school run by the Sisters of St. Mary, a place where middle-class Belgian families sent their daughters to receive a Catholic education and their sons to learn discipline and devotion. The nuns who lived there were not spies or soldiers. They were teachers, caretakers, women who had dedicated their lives to service and sacrifice. Mother Superior Leonie herself had entered the order at the age of 22, leaving behind the possibility of marriage and motherhood to become a bride of Christ. For 35 years, her life had followed a predictable rhythm: morning prayers at dawn, lessons for the children, evening vespers, and sleep. The greatest crisis she had ever faced was a shortage of firewood during a particularly harsh winter, or a conflict between two students over a stolen book. War was something that happened in distant countries, something she read about in newspapers, but never truly believed would touch her doorstep. But then came May of 1940, and everything she thought she knew about safety and stability collapsed in a matter of days. The German army swept through Belgium with terrifying speed, overwhelming the defenses and forcing King Leopold III to surrender after just 18 days of fighting. The occupation that followed was not the civilized, orderly affair the Nazis had promised. It was brutal, methodical, and designed to strip away every ounce of resistance. Jewish businesses were marked and then closed. Jewish families were required to register with the authorities, to wear yellow stars, to live under curfews and restrictions that grew tighter with each passing month. By 1942, the deportations had begun in earnest. Trains packed with men, women and children left Belgium every week, bound for labor camps in the east. The official story was that they were being resettled, given new homes and new jobs in occupied Poland. But whispers of a darker truth had begun to spread through the underground networks of the resistance. Mother Superior Leonie had tried to stay out of politics. She believed that the convent's mission was spiritual, not political, and that involving herself in the affairs of the occupation would only put the children in her care at greater risk. But in the autumn of 1942, a rabbi she had known for years came to her door in the middle of the night. His name was Rabbi Menachem Klein, and he had been a fixture in the Jewish quarter of Brussels for decades, a man of learning and compassion who had always shown respect for the Catholic faith, even as he remained deeply committed to his own. Now, standing in the dim light of the convent's entryway, he looked like a ghost. His clothes were threadbare, his face gaunt, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. He did not ask for food or shelter for himself. He asked for something far more dangerous, a place to hide the children. Rabbi Klein explained the situation with a calm that belied the horror of his words. The Nazis were no longer content with deporting adults. They were coming for the children now, rounding them up from schools and orphanages, taking them from their parents' arms and loading them onto trains that disappeared into the night. The Jewish community had organized a network of hiding places, safe houses scattered throughout the city and countryside, where children could be given false identities and sheltered until the war ended. But the network was stretched thin, and there were more children than there were hiding places. He had come to Mother Superior Leonie because he knew her to be a woman of integrity, a woman who would not turn away a child in need, even if that child was not of her faith. He was asking her to risk everything, her safety, her convent, her nuns, and the non-Jewish children already under her care. He was asking her to become a criminal in the eyes of the occupying power. Mother Superior Leonie did not hesitate. She told Rabbi Klein to bring the children, and over the next 6 months, 74 Jewish boys and girls disappeared from the streets of Brussels and reappeared inside the walls of the convent with new names, new identities, and a shared understanding that their survival depended on absolute silence. They became Catholics on paper, learning prayers and hymns they did not believe in, attending Mass and confession, all while secretly clinging to the faith their parents had instilled in them. It was an impossible balancing act, but for 6 months it worked. The Gestapo had too many raids to conduct, too many deportations to organize, and the convent was just one of hundreds of religious institutions scattered throughout Belgium. It was not on their list of priorities. Until the morning of April 15, 1943, when the bombs started falling and the entire equation changed in an instant. The Allied bombing campaign over Belgium in the spring of 1943 was not designed to kill civilians. But war has a way of ignoring intentions. The targets were German military installations, railway junctions and supply depots that fed the Nazi war machine. But bombs dropped from 10,000 feet do not always land where they are meant to, and the city of Brussels, with its narrow medieval streets and densely packed neighborhoods, was particularly vulnerable to collateral damage. On the morning of April 15th, the raid began just after 6 in the morning, earlier than usual, catching the city off guard. The first explosions were distant, almost abstract, like thunder rolling in from the horizon, but within minutes, the sound grew closer, louder, and more terrifying. Buildings shook, windows shattered, and the convent, which sat less than half a mile from a major railway yard that had been converted into a German supply hub, found itself directly in the path of the bombardment. Mother Superior Leonie had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, though she had always imagined it would be the Gestapo, not Allied bombers, that forced her hand. She had prepared escape routes, hidden documents and contingency plans for moving the children in small groups under cover of darkness. But none of those plans accounted for a daylight evacuation during an active air raid, as the walls of the convent trembled and plaster dust began to fall from the ceilings. She realized that her carefully laid plans were worthless. There was no time for subtlety, no time for caution. The children had to leave immediately, all 74 of them, and they had to leave together. Splitting them up would mean losing track of some, and losing track of even one child was unacceptable. She gathered the nuns and told them to wake every child, dress them warmly, and bring them to the main hall within 10 minutes. There were no questions, no debates. The nuns had known this day might come, and they moved with practiced efficiency. The children ranged in age from 4 to 14, and their reactions to the chaos were as varied as their backgrounds. The older ones understood the danger and moved quickly, helping the younger children tie their shoes and button their coats. The youngest were confused and frightened, clinging to the nuns and asking questions that had no good answers. Why were they leaving? Where were they going? Would their parents be there? Mother Superior Leonie could not afford to comfort them with lies, but she also could not afford to tell them the full truth, that their parents were likely already dead or deported, that the convent was no longer safe, and that their only chance of survival was to walk out into a city being torn apart by bombs and hope that God and luck would carry them through. Instead, she simply told them they were going on a journey, that they needed to stay close together, and that no matter what happened, they must remain silent. Silence had kept them alive for 6 months. It would have to keep them alive for a few more hours. The plan, if it could even be called a plan, was to head south toward the countryside, away from the railway yards and the industrial zones that were the primary targets of the bombing. Mother Superior Leonie had a contact in a small village about 15 miles outside of Brussels, a farmer who was part of the resistance network and had agreed to shelter refugees if the situation ever became desperate. 15 miles, on foot, with 74 children, through a city under bombardment, through Nazi checkpoints and patrols, through streets that might collapse at any moment. It was insane. It was impossible. But it was the only option. She gathered the children in the main hall, looked at their faces, some tear-streaked, some defiant, some simply blank with shock, and told them they were leaving. She divided them into groups of 10, each group led by a nun who would be responsible for keeping them together. The children were instructed to hold hands, to walk quickly but not run, and to stay absolutely silent unless spoken to by an adult. If they encountered German soldiers, they were to act calm, to smile if necessary, and to let the nuns do the talking. At 7:15 in the morning, as the bombs continued to fall and the city burned, Mother Superior Leonie opened the doors of the convent and led 74 Jewish children out into the streets of Brussels. The sky above them was dark with smoke, and the sound of explosions echoed off the buildings like the drumbeat of an approaching apocalypse. There was no turning back now. They were committed. And as they stepped out into the chaos, every single one of them, children and nuns alike, understood that the next few hours would determine whether they lived or died. The walk had begun, and the world was on fire. The streets of Brussels that morning were a vision of controlled panic. People ran in every direction, some toward air raid shelters, others away from buildings they feared would collapse. Shopkeepers pulled metal shutters down over their windows. Mothers clutched their children and sprinted for cover. And through it all, the sound of the sirens continued, a relentless wail that made it impossible to think clearly or move calmly. Mother Superior Leonie led her procession of 74 children directly into this chaos, walking with a deliberate pace that was neither too fast nor too slow. Too fast would draw attention, would make them look like they were fleeing something. Too slow would leave them exposed to the bombs. She kept her eyes forward, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were leading a prayer procession, and behind her the children followed in their groups of 10, holding hands, silent as ghosts. They looked, to any casual observer, like a school group on an unfortunate field trip, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was precisely the impression Mother Superior Leonie wanted to create. The first checkpoint came less than 10 minutes into their journey. 2 German soldiers stood at the intersection of Rue de la Loi and Rue Royale, their rifles slung over their shoulders, smoking cigarettes and watching the chaos with expressions of bored indifference. They were not Gestapo, not SS, just ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers assigned to traffic control duty, the kind of men who had been conscripted into the army and sent to occupy a foreign country they had no personal hatred for. They were dangerous nonetheless. One word from them, one order to halt and present papers, and the entire plan would collapse. Mother Superior Leonie did not slow down. She walked directly toward them, her face calm, her stride confident, and as she passed she nodded politely and said in perfect German that she was evacuating the children to safety outside the city. One of the soldiers glanced at the procession, took a long drag from his cigarette and waved them through. They did not ask for papers, they did not ask questions, they simply let them pass. It was the first miracle of the day, though Mother Superior Leonie did not allow herself to feel relief. There would be more checkpoints, more soldiers, and not all of them would be so indifferent. The bombing intensified as they moved deeper into the city. A building 3 blocks away took a direct hit, collapsing in a cloud of dust and debris that rolled down the street like a wave. The children flinched but did not scream. They had been trained for this, drilled on the importance of silence, and even the youngest among them understood that their lives depended on obedience. The nuns tightened their grips on the hands of the children nearest to them and kept walking. There was no shelter they could run to, no basement they could hide in. The only safety lay in distance, in putting as many miles as possible between themselves and the targets of the Allied bombs. Mother Superior Leonie could feel the eyes of the city on them, shopkeepers peering through cracks in their shutters, residents watching from upper-story windows, but no one stopped them. No one asked questions. In a city being torn apart by war, a group of children being evacuated by nuns was not unusual. It was, in fact, expected. By the time they reached the southern edge of Brussels, nearly 2 hours had passed and the children were exhausted. The youngest ones were crying softly, their legs trembling from the effort of walking without rest. The older children carried some of the younger ones on their backs, their faces pale and slick with sweat. Mother Superior Leonie called for a brief stop in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse, allowing the children to sit and catch their breath. The nuns distributed what little food they had brought, stale bread, a few apples, water from canteens. It was not enough, but it would have to do. As the children ate in silence, Mother Superior Leonie looked back toward the city and saw the black smoke rising into the sky, columns of it stretching toward the heavens like the fingers of some terrible god. The convent was somewhere in that smoke, and she wondered if it was still standing or if it had been reduced to rubble. It did not matter now. They could not go back. The only direction was forward. The second checkpoint came as they crossed the city limits into the countryside. This time, there were 4 soldiers, and they were not Wehrmacht. They were SS, identifiable by the lightning bolt insignia on their collars and the cold, predatory way they looked at the approaching group. Mother Superior Leonie felt her heart seize in her chest, but she did not break stride. She walked directly toward them, and when the lead officer held up his hand and ordered her to stop, she did so with the calm demeanor of someone who had nothing to hide. He asked where they were going. She told him they were evacuating to a church in the countryside, away from the bombs. He asked why there were so many children. She told him the convent had been caring for orphans and refugees, children whose parents had been killed or displaced by the war. It was the truth, or at least a version of it. The officer looked at the children, his eyes scanning their faces, and Mother Superior Leonie felt time slow to a crawl. If he asked for papers, if he demanded to see identification, it was over. But after a long, agonizing moment, he stepped aside and told her to move quickly before the next wave of bombers arrived. They walked past him, 74 children and 6 nuns, and no one looked back. The countryside beyond Brussels was a different world entirely. The narrow cobblestone streets gave way to dirt roads, lined with hedgerows and fields that stretched toward the horizon. The sound of the bombing faded into the distance, replaced by the rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional distant rumble of artillery fire from some unseen front. The children, who had been silent and tense throughout the walk through the city, began to relax slightly, though exhaustion was etched into every line of their small bodies. They had been walking for nearly 4 hours now, and the youngest ones could barely keep their eyes open. Mother Superior Leonie knew they could not stop for long, not yet, but she also knew that pushing them beyond their limits would be just as dangerous as staying in Brussels. She called for another rest, this time in a small grove of trees that provided cover from the road. The children collapsed onto the grass, some of them falling asleep almost immediately, their heads resting on the laps of the older children or the nuns. But Mother Superior Leonie could not afford to rest. She stood at the edge of the grove, her eyes scanning the road in both directions, watching for any sign of German patrols or collaborators who might report their presence. The countryside was not as safe as it appeared. Belgium was crawling with informants, ordinary citizens who had chosen to side with the occupiers in exchange for money, food, or simply the promise of being left alone. A group of 74 children traveling without proper authorization was suspicious, and suspicion in occupied Belgium could be fatal. She knew that the longer they stayed on the main road, the greater the risk of being stopped, questioned, and discovered. But the alternative, cutting through the fields and forests, would slow them down and increase the chance of getting lost. She had to trust that the same chaos that had allowed them to escape Brussels would continue to work in their favor. The Germans were focused on the bombing, on putting out fires and securing damaged infrastructure. They did not have the resources to chase down every group of refugees fleeing the city. After 30 minutes, Mother Superior Leonie roused the children and got them moving again. The road ahead led through a series of small villages, each one a potential hazard. In the first village they passed, an old woman standing in her doorway watched them with narrow, suspicious eyes. Mother Superior Leonie smiled and nodded, and the woman said nothing, but the encounter left her shaken. How many other eyes were watching them? How many people had already noticed the strange procession of children and nuns and decided to say nothing, or worse, decided to report it to the authorities? There was no way to know. She could only keep moving and hope that the people of Belgium, even those who had accommodated the occupation, still had enough humanity left to look the other way when children were involved. By early afternoon, they reached the outskirts of the village where Mother Superior Léonie's contact lived. The farmer's name was Henri Dubois, a man in his 60s who had lost his son to the Gestapo 2 years earlier for distributing underground newspapers. He had been part of the resistance ever since, providing safe houses for Jews, downed Allied pilots, and anyone else fleeing Nazi persecution. Mother Superior Léonie had sent word ahead through the resistance network that she might need his help, but she had no way of knowing if the message had reached him or if he would even be willing to take in 74 children. As they approached his farmhouse, a modest stone building surrounded by fields of wheat, she saw him standing in the doorway, waiting. His face was weathered and grim, but when he saw the children, something in his expression softened. He stepped forward, looked at Mother Superior Léonie, and asked only one question. How many? When she told him 74, he did not flinch. He simply nodded and told her to bring them inside. The farmhouse was not large, but Henri Dubois had prepared as best he could. He had cleared out his barn, filled it with straw for bedding, and gathered what food he could spare, bread, cheese, milk, and a few vegetables from his garden. It was not much, but it was more than the children had eaten in days. As they filed into the barn, Mother Superior Léonie finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what they had just accomplished. They had walked 15 miles through a city under bombardment, past German checkpoints and SS patrols, and arrived at a place of relative safety without losing a single child. It was nothing short of miraculous. But as she watched the children collapse onto the straw, their faces pale and drawn, she knew that the danger was far from over. They could not stay here forever. Henri Dubois was risking his life by sheltering them, and the longer they remained, the greater the chance that someone would notice and report them. The war was not over. The hunt for Jewish children was not over. And Mother Superior Léonie's work was far from finished. The first night at Henri Dubois' farm was the quietest the children had experienced in months. For the first time since they had been torn from their families and hidden behind convent walls, they were away from the constant fear of Gestapo raids and the sound of jackboots in the streets. The barn was cold and drafty, and the straw bedding was rough against their skin, but it was shelter, and shelter in occupied Belgium was a luxury few could afford. The children huddled together for warmth, whispering to one another in voices so low they were almost inaudible. Some of them spoke of their parents, wondering aloud if they were still alive, if they would ever see them again. Others were silent, their eyes staring into the darkness as if searching for answers that would never come. Mother Superior Léonie moved among them, offering what comfort she could, a hand on a shoulder, a whispered prayer, a promise that they were safe for now. But she knew that safety was a relative term in a country under occupation, and that the word itself had become almost meaningless. Henri Dubois proved to be more than just a safe house provider. Over the next few days, he became a lifeline for the entire group. He used his connections within the resistance network to secure additional food and supplies, trading favors and calling in debts to ensure that the children had enough to eat. He brought them fresh milk from his cows, eggs from his chickens, and bread baked by his neighbor, an elderly widow who asked no questions and expected no explanations. He also brought news from Brussels, and the news was grim. The bombing raid on April 15th had killed over 300 civilians and left entire neighborhoods in ruins. The convent of the Sisters of St. Mary had taken a direct hit and was now little more than a pile of rubble. If Mother Superior Léonie had delayed the evacuation by even an hour, every single one of the 74 children would have been buried alive. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and for the first time since the journey began, she allowed herself to weep. She wept for the building that had been her home for decades, for the other nuns who had not been there that day, and for the sheer, impossible luck that had allowed her to save the children. But there was no time to dwell on grief or gratitude. The destruction of the convent had created a new problem. The children were now officially missing. The Gestapo would have combed through the rubble looking for bodies, and when they found none, they would have started asking questions. Where had the children gone? Who had helped them escape? The fact that 74 children had vanished without a trace would not go unnoticed, and it would not be forgiven. The Nazis were meticulous record keepers, and the Jewish children who had been hidden in the convent were on their lists, marked for deportation. Their disappearance would trigger an investigation, and that investigation would eventually lead to the resistance network, to Henri Dubois, and to the barn where the children were now hiding. Mother Superior Léonie knew they could not stay here for more than a few weeks at most. They needed to find a more permanent solution, a place where 74 children could disappear completely, where they could live out the war without fear of discovery. Henri Dubois had an idea, though it was as dangerous as it was audacious. There was a network of Catholic families scattered throughout the Belgian countryside, families who had agreed to take in Jewish children and raise them as their own until the war ended. It was part of a broader rescue operation, organized by the Resistance and the Catholic Church, an operation that had already saved hundreds of children from deportation. But placing 74 children all at once was unprecedented. It would require coordination, secrecy, and the cooperation of dozens of families who would be risking their lives to shelter children they had never met. Henri Dubois began making the arrangements, sending coded messages through the resistance network, contacting priests and nuns in neighboring villages, and slowly piecing together a plan. It would take time, weeks perhaps, but if it worked, the children would be dispersed across the countryside, each one given a new identity, a new family, and a chance to survive the war. Mother Superior Léonie agreed to the plan, though the thought of separating the children after all they had been through was almost unbearable. They had become a family of sorts, bound together by shared trauma and shared survival. But she also knew that keeping them together was a death sentence. As the days passed and the arrangements were made, Mother Superior Léonie watched the children begin to heal, if only slightly. They played in the fields around the farm, laughed for the first time in months, and slowly regained some of the innocence that the war had stolen from them. She knew it would not last. Soon, they would be separated, sent to live with strangers, forced to pretend to be someone they were not. Some of them would forget their real names, their real families, their real identities. Some of them would survive the war and spend the rest of their lives searching for parents who were already dead. But at least they would survive. At least they would have a chance. And in a war that had robbed millions of children of any chance at all, that was something. It was not justice, it was not fairness, but it was something. And for Mother Superior Léonie, something was enough. The plan to disperse the children began in early May of 1943, just 3 weeks after the evacuation from Brussels. Henri Dubois had worked tirelessly through the resistance network, and by the first week of the month, he had secured placements for all 74 children. The families who had agreed to take them in came from all walks of life: farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and factory workers. What they had in common was a willingness to risk everything for a child they had never met. Each family was given a cover story, a believable explanation for why a new child had suddenly appeared in their household. Some claimed the child was a distant cousin orphaned by the bombing. Others said they were refugees from the city whose parents had been killed. The stories varied, but the goal was always the same: to make the child invisible, to erase their Jewish identity so completely that even the most thorough Gestapo investigation would find nothing suspicious. It was identity theft in reverse, a deliberate act of erasure designed not to harm but to save. Mother Superior Léonie spent those 3 weeks preparing the children for what was coming. She sat with each one individually, explaining that they would be going to live with new families, that they would have to use their false names at all times, and that they must never, under any circumstances, reveal their true identities. For the older children, this was a burden they understood and accepted. They had lived with false names for months already, and they knew that survival meant silence. But for the youngest children, the ones who were 4, 5, 6 years old, the concept was harder to grasp. They asked questions that had no good answers. Would they ever see their real parents again? Would they remember their real names? Mother Superior Léonie told them the truth as gently as she could. She did not know. She hoped they would see their parents again, hoped the war would end soon, hoped that when it did, the families would be reunited. But hope was not certainty, and she refused to lie to them. They deserved at least that much. The first group of children left on May 8th, driven away in the back of a farmer's truck, covered with hay bales to avoid detection at checkpoints. Mother Superior Leonie stood in the farmyard and watched them go, her heart breaking with every meter of distance that opened between them. Over the next 2 weeks, the departures continued in small groups of 3 or 4 children at a time, each group carefully timed to avoid suspicion. Some were taken by families who came to the farm themselves, arriving in the dead of night and leaving before dawn. Others were escorted by members of the resistance, smuggled through back roads and forest paths to villages dozens of miles away. Each departure was a small death, a severing of the bonds that had been forged through months of shared fear and survival. The children cried, the nuns cried, and Mother Superior Leonie held herself together through sheer force of will, knowing that if she allowed herself to collapse, the entire operation would fall apart. By the end of May, only 12 children remained at the farm, the last group waiting for their placements to be finalized. These were the most difficult cases, children who were older, more recognizably Jewish in appearance or simply harder to place because the available families were running out. Mother Superior Leonie refused to send them to families she did not trust completely, refused to place them in situations where they might be mistreated or exploited. Henri Dubois worked around the clock to find suitable homes, and finally, in the first week of June, the last placements were secured. On June 7, 1943, exactly 8 weeks after the evacuation from Brussels, the final child left Henri Dubois' farm. Mother Superior Leonie stood alone in the barn that had been home to 74 children, surrounded by the empty straw bedding and the lingering smell of unwashed bodies and fear, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. 74 children, all of them alive, all of them hidden, all of them given a chance at survival. It was not a victory. There were no victories in a war like this. But it was something. The question that haunted her, the question that would haunt her for the rest of her life, was whether it had been enough. She did not know if the children would survive the rest of the war. She did not know if their hiding places would hold, if their false identities would stand up to scrutiny, if the families sheltering them would remain loyal when the Gestapo came knocking. She did not know if the parents who had entrusted their children to her care were still alive, or if they had already been murdered in the camps whose names she had only recently learned: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. She did not know if she would ever see any of the children again, or if this was the last time their faces would occupy her waking thoughts and her nightly prayers. All she knew was that she had done what she could, and that she would carry the weight of those 74 lives for as long as she lived. Mother Superior Leonie did not return to Brussels. The convent was destroyed, the city was under constant surveillance, and her name was almost certainly on a Gestapo watch list by now. The sudden disappearance of 74 children from a bombed building had not gone unnoticed, and the Nazi authorities had begun asking questions. Henri Dubois received word through the resistance network that investigators had been scouring the rubble of the convent, searching for bodies, and when they found none, they had started interrogating the neighbors, demanding to know where the children had gone. Some of the neighbors claimed they had seen nothing. Others, hoping to curry favor with the occupiers, reported seeing a group of nuns leading children out of the building just before the bombs hit. The Gestapo now knew that the children had been evacuated, and they were actively searching for whoever had orchestrated the escape. Mother Superior Leonie was a wanted woman, though she would not learn the full extent of the danger she was in until months later. Henri Dubois insisted that she stay at the farm, at least for the time being, but Mother Superior Leonie refused to remain idle. She had saved 74 children, but there were thousands more still in hiding, still in danger, still waiting for someone to help them. She began working with the resistance network in earnest, using her connections within the Catholic Church to identify other convents, monasteries and parishes that might be willing to shelter Jewish children. She traveled from village to village, always under cover of darkness, always using false names and forged documents, meeting with priests and nuns who were willing to risk their lives for the cause. It was exhausting, dangerous work, and there were times when she came within minutes of being caught. On one occasion, she was stopped at a checkpoint by an SS officer who demanded to see her papers. The documents Henri Dubois had provided for her were excellent forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless, and a thorough inspection would have revealed the deception. The officer looked at her papers, looked at her face, and then, for reasons she would never understand, handed them back and waved her through. She did not stop shaking until she was miles away from the checkpoint. The work continued throughout the summer and into the autumn of 1943. Mother Superior Leonie became a ghost, a figure who moved through the Belgian countryside leaving no trace, coordinating rescues, arranging hiding places, and ensuring that the children who had been saved remained hidden. She rarely slept more than a few hours a night, and she lost weight rapidly, her already thin frame becoming almost skeletal. The other members of the resistance begged her to slow down, to take care of herself, but she refused. Every day she rested was a day that a child might be discovered and deported. Every hour she spent in safety was an hour that someone else was suffering. She had been given a gift, the gift of being able to save lives, and she would not waste it on comfort or self-preservation. The war had taken so much from so many people. If she could give back even a fraction of what had been stolen, she would consider her life well spent. By the end of 1943, the network Mother Superior Leonie had helped build had saved an additional 132 Jewish children, bringing the total number of lives she had directly influenced to over 200. It was a staggering achievement, though she never thought of it in those terms. She did not keep count. She did not celebrate victories. She simply moved from one crisis to the next, one child to the next, one hiding place to the next. But the strain was beginning to show. She developed a persistent cough that would not go away, and her hands shook constantly from exhaustion and malnutrition. Henri Dubois, who had become something of a father figure to her, finally convinced her to rest for a few weeks in the early spring of 1944. She reluctantly agreed, returning to his farm for the first time in nearly a year. It was there, in the same barn where 74 children had once slept, that she finally allowed herself to collapse. She slept for 3 days straight, her body finally giving in to the months of relentless effort. When she woke, she was weak but clear-headed, and she knew that she could not continue at this pace. The war was entering its final phase, and she needed to survive long enough to see it end. The end, when it came, was both sudden and anticlimactic. In September of 1944, Allied forces liberated Brussels, driving the Germans out and bringing the occupation to a close. The war in Europe would continue for another 8 months, but for Belgium, the nightmare was over. Mother Superior Leonie returned to Brussels for the first time since the evacuation, walking through streets that were scarred by war, but no longer patrolled by enemy soldiers. The convent was still in ruins, a pile of broken stone and shattered wood, but the neighborhood around it had survived. She stood in front of the rubble and said a prayer for the building that had been her home, and for the children who had once been safe within its walls. Then she turned her attention to the next impossible task, finding the 74 children she had saved and reuniting them with whatever family members had survived the war. The search for the 74 children began in the autumn of 1944 and would continue for years. Mother Superior Leonie compiled a list from memory, writing down every name, both real and false, of every child she had helped evacuate. She contacted the families who had sheltered them, traveling once again through the Belgian countryside, but this time without fear of checkpoints or Gestapo raids. What she found was a patchwork of survival and tragedy. Some of the children were exactly where she had left them, living with families who had grown to love them as their own. Others had been moved multiple times as the war progressed, passed from one safe house to another when danger grew too close. A few had been discovered despite all precautions, arrested and deported in the final desperate months of the occupation when the Nazis intensified their efforts to meet deportation quotas. Mother Superior Leonie recorded each outcome with meticulous care, determined to account for every single child, to know their fates, and to honor their stories. The hardest part of the search was not finding the children, but finding their families. The concentration camps had been liberated by Allied forces in the spring of 1945, and the world was only beginning to comprehend the scale of the horror that had been perpetrated within their walls. The photographs emerging from places like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen showed skeletal survivors and mountains of corpses, evidence of an industrialized murder campaign that had killed 6 million Jews across Europe. Mother Superior Leonie pored over Red Cross lists of survivors, refugee registries and displaced persons camps, searching for the parents of the children she had saved. Some she found. They were broken, traumatized, barely recognizable as the people who had entrusted their children to her care 2 years earlier. But they were alive, and the reunions, when they happened, were moments of indescribable joy mixed with unbearable grief. The children had survived, but they had lost years of their childhood, their innocence, and in many cases their sense of identity. Other parents were never found. Their names appeared on transport lists that ended at Auschwitz or Treblinka, camps where almost no one survived. For those children, the families who had sheltered them became their only families. Some chose to stay with their adoptive parents, having formed bonds too strong to break. Others, especially the older children who remembered their real parents, struggled with the loss, caught between two identities and two worlds. Mother Superior Leonie did what she could to help them navigate this impossible situation. But she knew that there were wounds the war had inflicted that no amount of care or compassion could heal. The children had survived, but survival came with a cost that would follow them for the rest of their lives. By 1946, Mother Superior Leonie had accounted for 72 of the 74 children. 2 remained missing, their fates unknown. She never stopped searching for them, writing letters to refugee organizations, placing notices in newspapers, and following every lead no matter how unlikely. She would continue this search until her death in 1968, never finding closure, never knowing what happened to those 2 children. It was the one failure she could not forgive herself for, the one gap in an otherwise miraculous record of rescue. But for the 72 children she had found, she became a permanent part of their lives. They visited her, wrote to her, invited her to their weddings and the births of their children. They called her their guardian angel, though she always rejected the title. She was not an angel, she insisted. She was simply a woman who had done what needed to be done. The Catholic Church eventually recognized her efforts, awarding her honors and commendations, but Mother Superior Leonie declined most public recognition. She did not want awards or ceremonies. She wanted the world to remember the children, not her. She wanted people to understand that the rescue had not been the work of one woman, but of an entire network of ordinary people who had chosen courage over cowardice, compassion over complicity. Henri Dubois, the farmer who had sheltered them, the families who had taken the children in, the members of the resistance who had risked their lives to coordinate the operation. They were the heroes, she said, not her. But the children knew better. They knew that without Mother Superior Leonie's decision to walk 74 children through a burning city, none of them would have survived. They knew that she had carried them through the gates of hell and brought them back. And they never forgot. Mother Superior Leonie Peclet died in Brussels on March 12, 1968, at the age of 82. She had lived long enough to see the children she saved grow into adults, to hold their children and grandchildren, to witness the creation of the State of Israel and the trials at Nuremberg that brought some measure of justice to the victims of the Holocaust. But she did not live to see her story become widely known. For decades after the war, her actions remained largely hidden, known only to the families she had saved and the small circle of resistance members who had worked alongside her. The full account of the evacuation, the 14-mile walk through a city under bombardment, the 74 children saved from certain death, was not documented in any official history. It was a story told in whispers, passed down through families, preserved in handwritten letters and fading photographs. The world had moved on from the war, eager to rebuild and forget, and the quiet heroism of a Catholic nun who had defied the Nazis was lost in the noise of Reconstruction and Cold War politics. It was not until the 1990s, more than 50 years after the evacuation, that historians began to piece together the full scope of what Mother Superior Leonie had accomplished. Survivors and their descendants started coming forward, sharing their stories, and researchers began to connect the dots. What they discovered was astonishing. Mother Superior Leonie had not only saved the 74 children from the convent, but had also played a pivotal role in the broader rescue network that saved hundreds of Jewish children across Belgium. Her coordination, her courage, and her absolute refusal to accept defeat had made her one of the most effective rescuers of the entire war. In 1997, She was posthumously recognized as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. It was the highest honor the State of Israel could bestow on a non-Jew, and it came nearly 30 years after her death. The ceremony was attended by dozens of the people she had saved, now elderly themselves, who traveled from across the world to honor the woman who had given them life. Today, Mother Superior Leonie's story is taught in schools across Belgium and Israel, held up as an example of moral courage in the face of unimaginable evil. But for most of the world, her name remains unknown. There are no statues of her in Brussels, no monuments marking the route she walked with 74 terrified children while bombs fell around them. The convent where she lived and worked was never rebuilt, and the site is now occupied by a modern apartment complex whose residents have no idea what happened there 80 years ago. History, it seems, has a short memory for the quiet heroes, the ones who did not seek glory or recognition, but simply did what was right because there was no other choice. But the children remembered, and their children remembered. And now, finally, the world is beginning to remember too. Mother Superior Leonie Peclet walked 74 children through hell and brought them out the other side. She gave them life when the world had decided they should die. She refused to accept that evil could triumph, and in refusing she proved that even in the darkest moments of human history, there is always room for light. Her story is not just a story of the past. It is a reminder for the present and the future that ordinary people, armed with nothing but courage and compassion, can change the world. One child at a time. 74 children at a time, and that is a legacy worth remembering.